The call came in at 7:14 on a Saturday morning. I know the exact time because I was standing at the kitchen counter pouring my second cup of coffee, watching the birds at the feeder my wife had installed 22 years ago. Before she passed, before it was just me and my son in a house that suddenly felt 3 sizes too big, my phone buzzed across the granite, and I saw my son's name on the screen. I smiled. He didn't call enough, but when he did, it usually meant he needed advice about something. His truck, his finances, a work problem he couldn't untangle on his own. I liked being needed. I picked up on the second ring. "Hey, buddy, you're up early." There was a pause. Then a voice I didn't recognize, female, flat, almost bored, said, "Hi, is this Daniel?" I set down my coffee mug. "It is. Who's this?" "I'm Cassie. I'm your son's wife." I stood there for a moment, certain I had misheard her. My son, my 31-year-old son, who, as far as I knew, had been dating someone named Cassie for about 4 months, could not possibly have a wife. We talked every 2 weeks. He'd been at my house for Thanksgiving 6 weeks ago. He had sat right there at my kitchen table, eaten 2 helpings of the sweet potato casserole I'd learned to make after his mother died, and said absolutely nothing about an engagement. Nothing about a wedding. Nothing about plans of any kind, except that he was thinking about switching to a different shift at work. "I'm sorry," I said. "Could you say that again?" "We got married last weekend," she said. "In Vegas. It was small, just us. Marcus wanted to keep it simple. My son's name is Marcus, and apparently he had gotten married in Las Vegas without telling me, without inviting me, and was now letting his brand new wife make the phone call to break the news at 7:14 on a Saturday morning while I was feeding the birds. "Is Marcus there?" I asked. "He's sleeping." I wanted to reach out first, actually, because I figured it would be easier coming from me. She said this the way someone might say they'd already handled the dry cleaning. Efficient, practical, completely unbothered. "We're planning to come down to Nashville next month, and we were hoping to stay at the cabin." The cabin. She meant the property in Gatlinburg, a 4-bedroom log cabin in the Smoky Mountains that I had purchased 12 years ago with money I'd saved over 2 decades of working as a structural engineer. It had been my retirement plan, my peace of mind, the place I had taken Marcus every summer since he was 9 years old. We'd fished off the back deck together. We'd hiked the trail behind the property on the morning of his high school graduation. After his mother died, it was the only place where either of us could breathe properly for a while. "You're welcome to visit," I said carefully. "I'd love to meet her." "Great," Cassie said. "And we were also thinking, since you're not really using it full time, that it might make more sense for it to be in our names going forward. For tax purposes, Marcus said you'd probably understand." I didn't say anything for a long moment. "Marcus said that?" I finally asked. "He mentioned you were very practical about financial stuff. We've actually talked to someone about it, and they said the transfer process is pretty simple. Marcus can walk you through it when we come down." I told her I needed to go, that I had something on the stove. I didn't, and that I'd talk to Marcus later. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen in the early morning quiet, looking out at the bird feeder, trying to figure out what exactly had just happened to my life. Let me tell you a few things about my son, so you understand the full weight of that phone call. Marcus was born when I was 29. His mother, Linda, and I had been married 3 years by then, and we were young enough to think we were ready for anything. Marcus was an easy baby, a curious kid, a boy who took apart every electronic device in the house just to see how it worked, and to his credit, usually managed to put most of them back together. He was smart, genuinely smart. He got a full scholarship to the University of Tennessee for mechanical engineering, and I drove him to Knoxville myself, helped him carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs, and cried in the parking lot on the way home like I had any right to be surprised that children grow up. Linda died during his sophomore year. Pancreatic cancer, which is exactly as fast and brutal as you've heard. She was diagnosed in October and gone by February. Marcus drove home every weekend for those 4 months, and when it was over, he took a semester off to make sure I was okay. I told him not to. He did it anyway. That was the kind of son he was. He went back to school, finished his degree, got a job at a manufacturing plant outside of Nashville, and for the last several years we had settled into a rhythm that worked for us. Sunday dinners when he could make it, phone calls every couple of weeks. The cabin every summer, where we grilled on the back deck and talked about Linda without it hurting quite as much as it used to. 4 months ago, he told me he'd met someone. Her name was Cassie. She worked in marketing. He seemed happy. I was glad for him. I'd asked a few times if he wanted to bring her to dinner, and he'd said soon, and I hadn't pushed because I didn't want to be that father. Now I was standing in my kitchen being told, not by my son, but by a woman I had never met, that she was my daughter-in-law, and that they'd like me to sign over my property. I called my son's phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I left a message telling him to call me when he woke up. Then I poured out my cold coffee, made a fresh pot, and sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the way I have done every time in my life when something complicated needed to be thought through clearly. Marcus called back that afternoon. "Dad." His voice had that particular quality it gets when he already knows a conversation is going to be difficult, slightly too casual, slightly too even. I'd heard it when he wrecked my car at 17. I'd heard it when he told me he'd failed an exam he hadn't mentioned taking. "Tell me about your wedding," I said. He exhaled. "I know how it sounds. I'd like to hear how it actually is." He told me the story. They'd gone to Vegas for a friend's birthday. On the last night, on an impulse, they'd gotten married at one of those chapels on the Strip. He said it felt right. He said he knew it was sudden. He said he'd been planning to call me the next day, but then Cassie suggested she reach out first to break the ice, and he'd thought that was a good idea. "She told me about the cabin," I said. Silence. "Marcus, it was just something we were talking about," he said. "It doesn't have to be a big thing." She mentioned speaking to someone about the transfer process. More silence, longer this time. "Cassie does a lot of research," he said finally. "She likes to be prepared." "How much do you know about her?" I asked. 4 months is not a long time. His voice shifted then. Not angry, but something close to defensive, the tone of a man who has been having a different version of this conversation in his own head and has already decided how it ends. He told me he was 31 years old. He told me he knew what he was doing. He told me he understood I was surprised, but that he needed me to respect his choices. I told him I respected him completely. I told him I was glad he was happy. I told him I looked forward to meeting Cassie in person. And then I called my attorney. Her name is Patricia, and she has handled my legal and financial affairs for 11 years. I trust her the way you trust someone who has helped you through a spouse's estate, a business dispute, and the refinancing of a mountain property without once making you feel like you don't understand your own life. I sat across from her desk on a Tuesday afternoon and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I appreciate most about her. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked me a few specific questions about the timeline. How long had Marcus known Cassie? Whether I had ever put Marcus's name on the cabin deed, whether I had made any verbal promises about inheritance. The answer to all 3 was no, 3 months, and no. She told me that what I was describing, a quick marriage, an immediate approach to asset transfer framed as practical rather than personal, the wife making contact instead of the son, followed a pattern she had seen before. She was careful not to say anything definitive about Cassie's intentions. She said she could only speak to what the situation looked like from a legal perspective, and from that perspective, the most important thing I could do right now was make sure my assets were properly structured before I had any further conversations about transferring anything. We spent 2 hours in her office. When I left, I had a plan. The following week, I had a long conversation with my financial advisor. His name is Greg, and he's been helping me manage my retirement accounts since I was 45. I told him the same story I'd told Patricia, and he had a similar reaction, measured, professional, and quietly concerned. We restructured things. The cabin went into a revocable living trust, with specific conditions attached to any future transfers. My liquid assets were organized in a way that made them considerably less accessible than they might have appeared from the outside. I updated my estate documents. I did not do any of this in secret. I simply did it, the way any reasonable person should manage their own finances without asking permission from someone who had been married for 11 days. I did not tell Marcus any of this. Not yet. He and Cassie drove down from Nashville on a Friday afternoon in early February. I had spent the morning cleaning the house, which I do when I'm nervous, and by noon the kitchen was spotless, and there was a pot of chili on the stove. Because it was cold, and because Linda always said the chili was the most honest thing you could serve someone. It told you right away whether you were welcome. They pulled into the driveway at 3 o'clock. I watched from the front window as Marcus got out first, and then Cassie stepped out from the passenger side. She was younger than I'd expected, late 20s with the kind of deliberate casualness that takes effort. She looked at my house with an expression I couldn't quite read from that distance. Not impressed, not unimpressed, assessing. Marcus hugged me at the door, and it was a real hug, the kind that lasts a second longer than polite, the kind that means something, whatever else was happening. This was still my son. I held on to that. Cassie shook my hand and smiled. "It's so good to finally meet you," she said. "Marcus talks about you all the time." "I hope some of it was good," I said, which is a thing people say. And she laughed, which is what people do. We had dinner. The chili was good. I asked Cassie about her work, her family, where she'd grown up. Ohio, 2 siblings. Her parents were still together. She'd moved to Nashville 3 years ago for a job that didn't work out, and then found a better one. She was easy to talk to. Charming, actually. Smart. I understood what Marcus saw in her. After dinner, Marcus helped me with the dishes, and Cassie excused herself to make a phone call. Standing at the sink, my son and I didn't say much for a few minutes. The water ran. The familiar sounds of that kitchen settled around us. "She's great, Dad," he said. "She seems like it," I said honestly. He glanced at me sideways. "Are you going to be okay with this?" "I am okay with this," I said. "I just want to make sure you know what you're doing." "I do." I nodded. I handed him a bowl to dry. "When did the cabin come up?" I asked, keeping my voice the same way Patricia keeps hers. Level, curious, not accusatory. He was quiet for a beat. Cassie brought it up a few weeks back. She said it seemed like a waste, having it sit empty most of the year. "It doesn't sit empty," I said. "I'm there every summer, and sometimes fall." "I know." She just meant, financially, it might make more sense for it to be in your names. He didn't answer. "Marcus," I said, still calm. "That cabin has my name on the deed because I bought it. I've paid the property taxes on it for 12 years. I've done every repair. It's where your mother and I planned to retire. It's where your mother and I planned to retire. It's where we scattered some of her ashes." I paused. "I'm not opposed to you having it someday, but I'm not signing it over to someone I met 4 hours ago." He put down the dish towel. For a moment, he looked exactly like he did at 17, standing in my driveway explaining the dent in my bumper. Like he knew I was right and hadn't figured out how to say so yet. "That's fair," he said quietly. "Thank you," I said. They stayed the weekend. It was mostly fine. Cassie was warm during meals and quieter than I expected the rest of the time. On Saturday morning, I found her in my office. The door had been open. She wasn't doing anything wrong exactly, but she was looking at the framed photograph on my bookshelf, the one of the cabin taken the summer after we bought it. "Is this the Gatlinburg property?" she asked. "It is," I said. "It's beautiful." She smiled. "Marcus loves that place." "We both do," I said. Sunday afternoon, they packed up and headed back. Marcus and I stood in the driveway while Cassie loaded the car, and he pulled me into another one of those real hugs. "I'll call you this week," he said. "I'd like that." He looked at me for a moment. "She's not trying to take anything from you, Dad." I looked at my son, this person I had driven to school and coached through heartbreaks and sat beside in a hospital waiting room when we were both terrified and lost. I wanted to believe him. I genuinely did. "Then there's nothing to worry about," I said. He didn't call that week. He called the following Thursday, and when he did, his voice was different. Not the careful casual of someone managing a hard conversation. This was something else. Quieter, flatter, like a man who hadn't been sleeping. "I need to tell you something," he said. I sat down. He told me that 2 days after they'd gotten back to Nashville, Cassie had mentioned, casually, over dinner, that she had some credit card debt she'd been working through. About $40,000 spread across 3 cards. She framed it as something she was handling. Nothing serious, just part of life. But then, a few days later, she'd suggested that one way to address it would be to take out a loan against the cabin. A quick, clean solution, she'd said, and I could pay myself back over time from rental income. Marcus had told her no. She had pushed, not aggressively, reasonably. With spreadsheets, actually, which he said he should have found impressive, but instead found unsettling because he hadn't known about the debt before the wedding and now there were spreadsheets. He'd called a friend of his, an older guy from work who'd been through a divorce and knew something about financial red flags. His friend had asked a few pointed questions, and then Marcus had started looking more carefully at things Cassie had said in passing over the past few months. Small things, comments about his income, questions about what I owned, her curiosity about the cabin that had surfaced earlier than he'd remembered. "Dad," my son said, "I think I made a mistake." I sat very still. "Tell me everything," I said. He talked for an hour. I listened to all of it. When he was done, I didn't say anything self-righteous. I didn't remind him that I'd had questions, that I'd expressed concern, that I'd sat in Patricia's office 2 weeks after a stranger called me at 7 in the morning to ask about my property. I didn't say any of that because that's not what my son needed from me in that moment. What he needed was his father. "Okay," I said, "here's what we're going to do." I connected Marcus with Patricia. She met with him twice and helped him understand what his options were given that they'd been married less than 2 months. She was thorough and honest and did not sugarcoat anything. The situation was complicated, but it was not impossible. I also connected him with Greg, who talked to him about his own financial picture, what he had, what he owed, what he needed to protect. Marcus had always been good with money in a general way, the way you are when you've watched a parent manage carefully, but he'd never sat down with an actual financial advisor. He came out of that meeting quieter and more focused than I'd seen him in years. I drove up to Nashville on a Thursday in late March. We sat in his apartment and talked for 5 hours. Not about Cassie, about everything else. About Linda. About the years after she died. About what he wanted his life to look like. About the fact that marrying someone 4 months in Vegas, without telling his father, was perhaps a decision worth examining with some honesty. He's a good man, my son. He knows when something's true, even when it's uncomfortable. The conversation with Cassie happened a few weeks later. I wasn't there for it, and I wouldn't tell you the details even if I knew them all, because that part belongs to Marcus. What I can tell you is that it was difficult and honest and necessary, and that my son handled it with more maturity than I would have at his age. The marriage ended. It took several months, and it was not clean, and there were moments when I watched my son carry something very heavy and felt the specific helplessness of a parent who can support but cannot carry it for him. Patricia handled the paperwork. The cabin remained exactly where it had always been, in my name, in a trust, protected. What I'll tell you about Cassie is only this. I don't think she was purely mercenary. I think she was someone in real financial trouble who saw a solution and moved toward it without fully considering what she was doing or who she was affecting. That doesn't make it okay, but it makes it human, and I've found that understanding something is not the same as forgiving it before it's time. This past July, Marcus and I drove up to Gatlinburg together for the first time in 3 years. We got there on a Friday evening, and the mountains were that particular shade of blue-green. They turn in midsummer, the kind of color that doesn't look real until you're standing inside it. I unlocked the cabin, and the smell hit me the way it always does. Wood, and something faintly cool, a smell that has always meant exactly one thing to me. We put our bags down and went straight out to the back deck. We sat there until it was dark, grilling steaks and talking and not talking in equal measure. The fireflies came out sometime around 9 o'clock, the way they do in Tennessee in July, and for a long while neither of us said anything at all, and it was the most comfortable silence I'd felt in a very long time. "I'm sorry, Dad," Marcus said at some point. "I know," I said. "I should have called you. Before. I should have. Marcus." I looked at my son in the dark, this 31-year-old man who'd once taken apart my television remote just to see how it worked, and then spent 4 months coming home every weekend to sit beside his dying mother. "You made a mistake. You've made a few. So have I." He was quiet. "Your mother used to say that the thing about making mistakes is that they only ruin you if you refuse to learn from them." I paused. "Did I ever tell you she said that?" "About 100 times," he said. We both laughed, and that laughter over the back deck of that cabin in those mountains at that particular moment is something I will carry for the rest of my life, right next to the grief, right next to everything we've been through, in that part of a person where the things that matter most are kept. The cabin will be his someday. That was always true. I just needed to know first that he understood what it meant, not the square footage or the market value or what you could borrow against it, but what it actually is. A place built from years of work and love and loss and showing up. A place that holds the shape of the people who've been in it. He understands it now. That's the whole story. That's all of it. And if you're listening to this and you have a child you've given everything to, or a parent you haven't called in too long, I hope you'll take from it whatever is useful to you. Because none of us get this right on the first try. We just have to keep trying and keep showing up and hold on to the things that are worth holding. I'm going to go make some coffee. The birds are waiting. I've thought a lot about what made the difference, not just in how this situation ended, but in why it unfolded the way it did at every step. When Cassie called that Saturday morning, she expected someone who could be managed. And I understand why. A man in his late 50s, living alone, clearly attached to his son, that can look from a certain angle like someone who will do almost anything to keep the peace. She wasn't entirely wrong about what she was looking at. She was just wrong about what it meant. What she didn't account for was that the years I'd spent working, saving, planning, raising Marcus on my own after Linda died, those years hadn't made me soft. They'd made me patient. And patient is not the same thing as passive. I had learned, through a long stretch of hard and quiet years, that the most important decisions rarely need to be made quickly. That the person who waits, who watches, who gathers information before acting, almost always ends up in a stronger position than the person who moves fast and demands. That's the thing about integrity over time. It accumulates. Every year I filed my taxes honestly, paid down the cabin mortgage, showed up for Marcus even when he didn't ask me to, put money into retirement accounts instead of buying things I didn't need. All of that was a form of preparation I didn't know I was making, not for this situation specifically, but for whatever situation eventually tested me. Life always sends one eventually. And Marcus, I don't want to speak about my son as though his mistake was simple or his recovery was easy, because neither is true. What I will say is that the moment he called me and said I think I made a mistake was one of the bravest things I have ever heard him do. Because admitting that, clearly, out loud, to your father, when everything in you wants to protect your own pride, that takes something real. That takes a kind of honesty that has to be built. You don't find that in a person who hasn't been through anything. Marcus had been through enough to know what honesty costs and pay it anyway. That's what I mean by character, not the absence of mistakes. None of us are getting out of this life without those, but the willingness to look at what you've done, name it accurately, and then do the harder work of fixing it. I'm not angry at Cassie. I said that in the story, and I mean it. Desperation makes people capable of things they might not otherwise choose. But desperation is also not an excuse, and understanding something is not the same as accepting it without consequence. I protected what I built. I had every right to. And I would do it again. What I hope you take from Daniel's story, from Marcus, from all of it, is simply this. The life you build with honesty and patience and discipline is not just financially stronger. It is structurally stronger. It holds up when things go wrong. When people try to take from you what you've earned, when the people you love make terrible decisions, when you're standing in a quiet kitchen at 7 in the morning trying to figure out how your life arrived at this particular moment, what carries you through is not luck. It is everything you did, quietly and without an audience, in all the years before. Build that. Protect it. And don't let anyone, not even someone you love, make you feel that doing so is anything less than right.